I thought I knew my parents until they dragged me into federal court, demanding I hand over my $4.2 million military inheritance. Then military coolies stormed the courtroom when I produced a single classified document that exposed a 20-year conspiracy none of us saw coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was sitting in my office at Fort Riverside, 3 weeks into leave from my deployment in Eastern Europe, when Captain Rodriguez knocked on my door without the usual formalities. That should have been my first warning. In the military, protocol isn't optional. It's oxygen. But Rodriguez looked like he'd been running marathons in his dress uniform. "Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," he said, setting a manila envelope on my desk with hands that weren't quite steady. "I need to inform you about your grandfather." My grandfather, General Theodore Hayes, had been more than family. He'd been my mentor, my inspiration for joining the Army, and the reason I'd pushed through every barrier the military threw at women in combat roles. At 78, he was still sharp enough to debate military strategy and stubborn enough to refuse using a cane despite his bad hip. "There's been an incident," Rodriguez continued, his voice taking on that careful tone they teach officers for delivering devastating news. "General Hayes suffered a massive heart attack yesterday evening at Walter Reed Medical Center. He didn't make it through surgery." The words hit like incoming artillery. I'd spoken to Grandpa Theodore just 4 days ago, arguing about the new tactical protocols in my unit were worth the paperwork headache. He'd laughed, that deep, raspy chuckle that came from 40 years of commanding respect and smoking too many cigars in officer clubs across 3 continents. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, watching my face carefully, "there's more. The general left specific instructions that you were to receive this immediately upon notification of his death." The envelope was heavier than it looked, official military stationery with multiple seals I didn't recognize. Inside were 3 items: a letter in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, a set of keys, and a document marked classified, eyes only, L.col.v.Hayes. The letter was brief, written in his characteristic no-nonsense style. "Victoria, if you're reading this, the old man finally met his match. 23 years in combat zones, and it was my own heart that took me down. There's an irony in there somewhere. I'm leaving you everything. The house in Colorado Springs, the investment accounts, the military pension benefits, all of it. Total value is approximately $4.2 million. I know that number will surprise you, but a lifetime of military service and smart investments adds up. More importantly, I'm leaving you the responsibility that comes with what I've discovered. The classified document in this envelope contains information about Operation Silent Harbor, something I uncovered 6 months ago that's bigger than both of us. Guard it with your life and trust no one in the family with its existence until you understand what it means. Your parents will come for the money. They've been asking about my estate plans for 2 years now, though they think I don't know. Don't let them manipulate you with guilt or family loyalty. What I've left you isn't just inheritance. It's insurance. You're the only one with the clearance, the character, and the backbone to handle what's coming. Stay strong, soldier. General Theodore Hayes." I read the letter 3 times before opening the classified document. What I found made my blood run cold. Operation Silent Harbor was a covert military contractor investigation that my grandfather had been conducting privately for the past 8 months. The files detailed systematic fraud within Defense Department contracts involving millions in diverted funds, falsified reports, and equipment that never reached deployed units. Soldiers had died because of faulty gear that was supposed to protect them. The most shocking part wasn't the scope of the fraud, it was the names involved. My own father, David Hayes, appeared throughout the documents as a civilian liaison facilitating contractor relationships. My mother, Patricia Hayes, was listed as receiving consultation fees from 3 different defense companies currently under investigation. My parents, who'd raised me to believe in honor, duty, and country, had been profiting from the same military-industrial complex that put my life at risk every time I deployed. That evening, I drove to my parents' house in Millfield Heights, the same suburban neighborhood where I'd grown up believing my father's civilian job at the Pentagon was boring paperwork, and my mother's business consulting was helping small companies with their taxes. They were waiting for me in the living room, dressed like they were heading to a funeral, which, I realized, they were. My father sat in his leather recliner, the one he'd claimed as his throne for 20 years. My mother perched on the edge of the sofa with her hands folded in her lap like she was posing for a church directory. "Victoria," my mother said, her voice dripping with the kind of sympathy that sounds practiced, "we know this is difficult, but we need to talk about practical matters." "Grandpa Theodore's estate," my father added, cutting straight to the point in a way that would have made the old man proud if it weren't so transparent. "We've spoken with a lawyer, and there are some irregularities with his will." I kept my expression neutral, a skill that 3 combat deployments had perfected. "What kind of irregularities?" My mother leaned forward, her eyes bright with what she probably thought looked like concern. "Well, sweetheart, it's just that leaving everything to one person, especially someone who's been overseas and might not understand the financial complexities, it doesn't seem like something Theodore would do."
"He always talked about taking care of the whole family," my father said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he'd used when explaining why I couldn't have a car at 16, or why I should consider more practical career options than the military. It makes sense that he'd want the inheritance divided equally among his children and grandchildren. I sat there, listening to my parents systematically dismantle my grandfather's final wishes, while a classified document in my jacket pocket detailed their involvement in fraud that had cost lives. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. "The will is legal and properly executed," I said finally. "I was there when he signed it last year." My father's jaw tightened slightly, the only tell that his calm demeanor was slipping. "Legal doesn't always mean fair, Victoria. Family means looking out for each other, not hoarding resources." "Theodore was getting old," my mother added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "People that age, they get confused about things. They make decisions based on who they saw last, not what's actually best for the family." That was the moment I understood this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a war. And they had no idea what ammunition I was carrying. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Before my world exploded in that courtroom, I was Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes, someone who'd built her entire identity around honor, precision, and protecting the people who couldn't protect themselves. 22 years in the Army had taught me that integrity isn't negotiable. It's the foundation everything else stands on. My morning routine at Fort Riverside was sacred. 500 hours physical training, 630 hours briefing with my intelligence unit, 800 hours reviewing classified reports from our European operations. I commanded a team of 43 analysts responsible for threat assessment across 3 time zones, and every decision we made could mean the difference between soldiers coming home alive or in flag-draped boxes. The work was demanding, but it was also deeply satisfying. When you grow up as the granddaughter of a decorated general, you understand that service isn't just a job, it's a calling. My grandfather had taught me that leadership meant making hard choices and living with the consequences, always putting mission and people before personal comfort. My colleagues at Fort Riverside knew me as someone they could count on. Major Stevens, my second in command, often joked that I was the only officer who'd never asked him to bend regulations, even when it would have made our lives easier. Sergeant First Class Martinez, who'd served under me for 6 years, once told me that working in my unit felt like having a commanding officer who actually gave a damn about doing things right. That reputation mattered to me more than any medal or promotion. In a military culture that still sometimes questioned whether women belonged in combat roles, I'd earned respect by being uncompromisingly professional and absolutely reliable. When other units needed someone to handle sensitive intelligence operations, they asked for my team. When younger female officers needed mentorship, they were directed to my office. My personal life was deliberately simple. I lived in base housing, drove a practical sedan, and spent most of my free time reading military history or working out in the post gym. I'd never married, not because I was opposed to it, but because I'd never found someone who understood that my commitment to the Army wasn't a phase or a stepping stone to something else. It was who I was. My relationship with my grandfather had been the cornerstone of my identity since I was 8 years old. General Theodore Hayes was everything I aspired to become: principled, fearless, and completely devoted to protecting American interests. He had served in Vietnam, the Gulf War, and had been instrumental in developing counterterrorism strategies that saved countless civilian lives. Growing up, I'd spent every summer at his house in Colorado Springs, learning to shoot, studying military tactics, and listening to stories about leadership under pressure. He never talked down to me because I was a girl, never suggested that I should consider easier paths. Instead, he taught me to think strategically, to question assumptions, and to never compromise my values for convenience. When I graduated from West Point, he was in the front row, his chest covered with ribbons that represented 50 decades of honorable service. When I received my first combat deployment orders, he was the one who helped me prepare mentally for the reality of war. And when I made lieutenant colonel at 32, younger than most of my male peers, he simply nodded and said, "About time they recognized what I've known for years." My parents had always been proud of my military career, at least on the surface. My father, David Hayes, worked as a civilian contractor liaison at the Pentagon, helping coordinate relationships between the Defense Department and private companies. My mother, Patricia Hayes, ran what she described as a small business consulting firm, though she was always vague about the details of her work. They lived comfortably in Millfield Heights, a suburb where military families mixed with defense contractors and government employees. Their house was the kind of place where neighborhood barbecues featured conversations about deployment schedules and security clearances, where everyone understood that some topics weren't discussed outside the family. I had always assumed my parents shared my grandfather's values. They'd raised me to believe in duty, honor, and country. They'd supported my decision to attend West Point, celebrated my promotions, and displayed my military awards on their mantelpieces like trophies. When I came home on leave, they'd introduce me to neighbors as "our daughter, the Army officer," with obvious pride in their voices. The night before my grandfather's funeral, I sat in my childhood bedroom, looking at photos that covered 24 years of military service. Pictures of me in dress uniform at various ceremonies, action shots from training exercises, formal portraits marking each promotion. In every image, I looked confident, competent, ready for whatever challenge came next. I'd built my entire adult life around the principles my grandfather had taught me, that honor was more valuable than money, that protecting others was worth personal sacrifice, and that integrity meant doing the right thing even when it cost you everything. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. I thought I understood the difference between right and wrong, between loyalty and betrayal. I thought the people who'd raised me to value honor actually shared those values themselves. I had no idea that everything I believed about my family was about to be systematically destroyed, one revelation at a time. And I had no idea that the classified document in my grandfather's envelope would soon become the most dangerous piece of paper I'd ever held. Dangerous enough to bring military police storming into a federal courthouse. Dangerous enough to expose corruption that reached the highest levels of defense contracting. And dangerous enough to turn my own parents from the people I'd trusted most into the enemies I'd have to defeat. The woman in those photos looked so sure of herself, so confident that she knew who the good guys were. Within 72 hours, that certainty would be nothing but wreckage, and I'd have to rebuild my understanding of honor, family, and duty from the ground up. But that night, I was still Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes, decorated officer, devoted granddaughter, and someone who believed that truth and justice were the same thing. I would learn soon enough how wrong I was about almost everything. The funeral was held on a Tuesday morning at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 12,
where my grandfather would rest among other generals who dedicated their lives to American military service. The sky was overcast, threatening rain that never came, as if even the weather was holding its breath out of respect for General Theodore Hayes. I stood at attention in my dress uniform, watching the honor guard perform the flag-folding ceremony with the precision my grandfather had demanded from every soldier under his command. The 21-gun salute echoed across the cemetery, each shot marking another memory of the man who'd shaped not just my career, but my entire understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. My parents flanked me during the service, both dressed in appropriate black, playing their roles as grieving family members. My father kept his expression stoic, befitting someone who'd worked in Pentagon circles for decades. My mother dabbed at her eyes with tissues, though I noticed her makeup remained perfect throughout the ceremony. After the service, as we walked back to the parking area, my father cleared his throat in that particular way that signaled he was about to bring up something uncomfortable. "Victoria, we need to schedule a meeting with the estate attorney. There are several matters that need immediate attention." "What kind of matters?" I asked, though the classified document hidden in my dress uniform jacket seemed to burn against my ribs with every step. "Well," said my mother, linking her arm through mine in a gesture that once would have felt comfortable, but now felt calculating, "there are tax implications to consider, property transfers, investment account management. It's really quite complex." My father nodded gravely. Theodore accumulated significant wealth over the years. The house in Colorado Springs alone is worth nearly $800,000, and that's not counting the mountain property he purchased in 2018. Then there are the military pension benefits, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies. They'd done their homework. As we reached the parking lot, my mother pulled out a leather folder. "We've already spoken with Harrison and Associates. They specialize in military estate law. They've prepared some preliminary paperwork that would establish a family trust, ensuring that Theodore's assets are managed responsibly." I took the folder, scanning the documents inside. The language was dense legal terminology, but the basic structure was clear. Establish a trust with my parents as co-trustees, liquidate individual assets into a managed fund, distribute proceeds according to family need and contribution. My name appeared as a beneficiary, not as the primary inheritor my grandfather had intended. "This isn't what Grandpa's will specifies," I said, handing the folder back. My father's jaw tightened slightly. "Victoria, I understand you're emotional right now. Grief can cloud judgment. But we're talking about $4.2 million in total assets. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. It requires professional management, not emotional decision-making." "Emotional," I repeated, my voice carrying the edge I developed during 3 combat deployments. "Sweetheart," my mother said, her voice dropping to that patronizing tone she'd used when I was 12 and refusing to wear dresses to church. "Theodore was 88 years old. People that age often make decisions based on recent interactions rather than long-term family welfare. He saw you more frequently because of your military service, but that doesn't mean he intended to exclude the rest of his family." I stared at her, trying to reconcile this calculated manipulation with the woman who taught me to ride a bicycle and cheered at my high school graduation. He was 78, not 88. And his will was executed 14 months ago when he was in perfect mental health. Legal technicalities aside, we're family. Family takes care of each other. Hoarding resources while other family members struggle financially isn't what Theodore would have wanted. That's when I realized they weren't just disappointed about the inheritance, they were desperate for it. Something in their financial situation was driving this aggressive push for immediate access to my grandfather's estate. "Are you having money problems?" I asked directly.
My parents exchanged a quick glance that lasted maybe half a second. But in that brief moment, I saw something that made my intelligence training kick into high gear. Fear. Not disappointment, not grief, not even greed, but genuine fear. Everyone has financial pressures, Victoria, my mother said carefully. Your father's consulting work has been inconsistent lately, and my business has been affected by the economy. We're not in crisis, but Theodore's resources could provide security for all of us. My father stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. There's something else you need to understand. Theodore's assets aren't just sitting in savings accounts earning minimal interest. He made some aggressive investment decisions in his final years. Cryptocurrency, foreign markets, some ventures that are frankly quite risky for someone his age. If those investments collapse, the entire estate could be worthless within months. This was a lie. I'd seen enough of my grandfather's financial documents over the years to know he was conservative with investments, favoring government bonds and blue-chip stocks. He'd once told me that gambling with money was like gambling with soldiers' lives, something honorable people simply didn't do. I'll need to see documentation of these risky investments, I said. That's exactly why we need to act quickly, my mother said, pulling another set of papers from her folder. Harrison and Associates can consolidate everything into managed accounts within 2 weeks, but it requires signatures from all beneficiaries to prevent any single person from making impulsive decisions that could jeopardize the entire estate. The papers were transfer authorizations, beautifully formatted and officially notarized, that would essentially give my parents control over every asset my grandfather had left me. The language was sophisticated enough to look legitimate, but designed to strip me of decision-making authority while keeping me technically listed as a beneficiary. I'm not signing anything today, I said, handing the papers back. My father's expression hardened. Victoria, we're not asking you to sign anything binding. These are preliminary authorizations that simply allow professional estate managers to prevent asset loss while we work through the legal process. Preliminary authorizations that happen to give you control over $4.2 million? Control? My voice rose slightly before she caught herself and modulated back to reasonable tones. We're talking about professional management, not personal control. Do you really think your father and I are trying to steal from our own family? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, because the honest answer, based on what I was seeing and what I knew from that classified document, was yes. I absolutely believed they were trying to steal from their own family. The only question was whether their desperation was driven by greed or by something more dangerous. I'll need to see documentation of these risky investments, I said. That's exactly why we need to act quickly, my mother said, pulling another set of papers from her folder. Harrison and Associates can consolidate everything into managed accounts within 2 weeks, but it requires signatures from all beneficiaries to prevent any single person from making impulsive decisions that could jeopardize the entire estate. The papers were transfer authorizations, beautifully formatted and officially notarized, that would essentially give my parents control over every asset my grandfather had left me. The language was sophisticated enough to look legitimate, but designed to strip me of decision-making authority while keeping me technically listed as a beneficiary. I'm not signing anything today, I said, handing the papers back. My father's expression hardened. Victoria, we're not asking you to sign anything binding. These are preliminary authorizations that simply allow professional estate managers to prevent asset loss while we work through the legal process. Preliminary authorizations that happen to give you control over $4.2 million. Control? My voice rose slightly before she caught herself and modulated back to reasonable tones. We're talking about professional management, not personal control. Do you really think your father and I are trying to steal from our own family? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, because the honest answer, based on what I was seeing and what I knew from that classified document, was yes. I absolutely believed they were trying to steal from their own family. The only question was whether their desperation was driven by greed or by something more dangerous. I need time to review everything with my own attorney, I said finally. Time is exactly what we don't have, my father replied sharply. Market conditions are volatile. Theodore's cryptocurrency holdings alone have lost 12% of their value in the past week. Every day we delay action is money literally disappearing.
I stood there in the Arlington parking lot, my grandfather's flag-draped casket still fresh in my memory, and watched my parents systematically lie to me about his financial situation, his mental capacity, and their own motivations. They were skilled at this, presenting their manipulation as concern, their greed as financial prudence, and their desperation as family loyalty. But they'd made one critical error. They were trying to run a con on someone trained in intelligence analysis, someone who'd spent years detecting deception in high-stakes environments. Every micro-expression, every verbal inconsistency, every emotional manipulation was as obvious to me as enemy movement across an open field. More importantly, they had no idea I was carrying a classified document that detailed their involvement in defense contractor fraud. They thought I was just their naive military daughter, someone who could be pressured into compliance through guilt and false urgency. As we drove away from Arlington in separate cars, I realized the stakes were higher than just $4.2 million. My grandfather hadn't just left me an inheritance, he'd left me evidence of corruption that reached deep into Pentagon contracting, evidence that could destroy careers and send people to federal prison. My parents weren't just trying to steal my inheritance, they were trying to silence the one person who could expose their criminal activities. And they'd chosen to do it by exploiting the trust and family loyalty they'd spent 24 years teaching me to value. The war was about to begin, and they had no idea how thoroughly I was prepared to fight it. 3 days after the funeral, I was reviewing intelligence reports in my Fort Riverside office when my personal phone rang. The caller ID showed Harrison and Associates Legal, which meant my parents had escalated from family pressure to professional intimidation. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, this is Attorney Jonathan Whitmore from Harrison and Associates. I represent your parents in matters concerning your grandfather's estate. I set down my pen and activated the recording app I'd installed that morning. In intelligence work, you document everything. Mr. Whitmore, I wasn't aware my parents needed legal representation for a family discussion. Well, that's precisely why I'm calling, he said, his tone carefully calibrated to sound both reasonable and authoritative. Your parents are concerned that grief may be affecting your judgment regarding General Hayes' estate. They've asked me to facilitate a more structured discussion about the practical realities of inheritance management. The practical realities are straightforward. My grandfather left a legal will that's been properly executed and filed. I'm the sole heir. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. Lieutenant Colonel, I've reviewed the documentation, and while the will is technically valid, there are several concerning factors that any probate court would want to examine closely. Such as?
Well, first, there's the matter of undue influence. General Hayes was in declining health, dependent on family members for transportation and companionship. The will heavily favors the family member who spent the most time with him in his final years, which could suggest manipulation of an elderly, vulnerable person. The accusation hit like a physical blow. My grandfather had been sharp as a combat blade until the day he died, but Whitmore was painting him as a confused old man who'd been manipulated by his granddaughter. It was both insulting and strategically clever. Second, he continued, there's the question of mental capacity. General Hayes made significant changes to his estate planning in the months before his death, including liquidating long-term investments to purchase what financial experts would consider high-risk assets. This pattern suggests cognitive decline that may have affected his decision-making. More lies, delivered with the confidence of someone who assumed I wouldn't have access to my grandfather's actual financial records. But I'd helped him manage his investments for the past 5 years, and I knew every transaction had been carefully researched and conservative. Finally, Whitmore said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, there's the matter of fairness. Your grandfather's estate represents a lifetime of military service and sacrifice. Concentrating that wealth in the hands of one person, regardless of their relationship to the deceased, goes against the principles of military brotherhood and family unity that General Hayes spent his career defending. The manipulation was sophisticated, wrapping greed in the flag, making theft sound like patriotism. But what bothered me most was how well they understood military culture, using our own values against us. Mr. Whitmore, are you threatening to contest my grandfather's will?
Not threatening, Lieutenant Colonel. I'm offering an opportunity for reasonable resolution before legal proceedings become necessary. Your parents have drafted a compromise proposal that would honor General Hayes's wishes while ensuring equitable treatment for all family members. I've seen their proposal. It gives them control of the estate. It establishes professional management of complex assets, he corrected smoothly. Your parents aren't seeking personal enrichment. They're trying to protect family wealth from impulsive decisions made during an emotional time. I nearly laughed at the audacity. They were positioning themselves as the responsible adults, protecting me from my own grief-driven poor judgment. And if I refuse their generous offer to steal my inheritance? I wouldn't characterize it as theft, Whitmore said, his tone sharpening slightly. But if you insist on proceeding with the current will arrangement, we'll have no choice but to file a formal challenge. That process typically takes 18 to 24 months, during which all assets remain frozen. Legal fees alone could consume 20 to 30% of the estate's value. There it was, the threat wrapped in legal courtesy. Sign over control voluntarily, or they'd tie everything up in court for 2 years while lawyers drain the accounts. You should also understand, he continued, that probate challenges become public record. Given your military position and security clearance, any suggestion of elder abuse or financial manipulation could have serious implications for your career. My blood ran cold. They were threatening to destroy my military career if I didn't surrender my grandfather's estate. The accusation of elder abuse would trigger an army investigation, potentially costing me my security clearance and ending 22 years of service. Mr. Whitmore, I said carefully, are you suggesting that defending my legal inheritance could damage my military standing? I'm simply noting that military personnel are held to higher standards of ethical conduct. Any public scrutiny of your relationship with your grandfather, particularly involving large sums of money, would naturally attract attention from your superiors. The threat was clear, but deniable, exactly the kind of legal intimidation that gave attorneys a bad reputation. But it also revealed how desperate my parents had become. They weren't just trying to steal money anymore. They were prepared to destroy my career to get it. I'll need to review everything with my own legal counsel, I said. Of course, Whitmore replied, his tone becoming friendly again now that he'd delivered his threats. But I'd encourage you to act quickly. Every day of delay costs money and increases the likelihood that this matter will require formal legal intervention. After he hung up, I sat in my office, staring at the phone, processing what had just happened. My parents had hired an attorney, specifically to threaten my military career unless I surrendered my inheritance. They were using my own dedication to service as a weapon against me. I opened my laptop and began researching Jonathan Whitmore. His firm specialized in estate challenges, with a particular focus on what they called inheritance dispute resolution, which seemed to be code for pressuring legitimate heirs into accepting reduced inheritances to avoid lengthy court battles. More interesting was Whitmore's client history. Over the past 3 years, he'd represented clients in 12 estate challenges. In 10 of those cases, the original heirs had ultimately agreed to reduced inheritances rather than face prolonged litigation. Only 2 cases had gone to trial, and Whitmore had lost both. He was a legal intimidation specialist, not a courtroom litigator. His entire business model was based on making the legal process so expensive and personally damaging that people would pay to make him go away. But as I dug deeper into his background, I found something that made my intelligence training kick into overdrive. Harrison and Associates had received significant payments from Meridian Defense Solutions, one of the contractors mentioned in my grandfather's classified documents. The payments were labeled as legal consultation services, but the timing corresponded exactly with periods when Meridian was bidding on major Pentagon contracts. My parents hadn't just hired any estate attorney. They'd hired a lawyer who was already connected to the defense contractor fraud that my grandfather had been investigating. Whether they'd chosen him deliberately or whether he'd sought them out, the connection meant this wasn't just about inheritance anymore.
It was about covering up a criminal conspiracy that reached deep into Pentagon contracting, and my parents were willing to destroy my military career to protect it. I locked my office door and pulled out the classified document my grandfather had left me. Operation Silent Harbor wasn't just evidence of fraud. It was evidence that could bring down dozens of people in the defense contracting world, including the attorney who just threatened me. My parents thought they were fighting a grieving granddaughter over money. They had no idea they were fighting someone who now held the ammunition to destroy everyone involved in the conspiracy they were desperately trying to hide. The war had just escalated from family drama to national security, and I was the only one who understood what we were really fighting about. The emotional assault began at exactly 0630 hours the next morning when my mother called, sobbing into the phone with the kind of manufactured desperation that would have won awards if this were a theater performance instead of psychological warfare. "Victoria, honey, I need you to know how much your father and I are hurting right now," she said between carefully timed sniffles. "We raised you to be better than this. We taught you that family comes first, that we take care of each other." I was in the middle of my morning run around the base perimeter, but I stopped and activated my phone's recording function. After Whitmore's threats yesterday, I was documenting every interaction. "Mom, what exactly am I doing that's hurting you?" "You're shutting us out," she said, her voice breaking in precisely the right places. "Your grandfather wouldn't have wanted his death to tear our family apart. He loved all of us equally, and now you're acting like we're strangers trying to steal from you." The guilt manipulation was textbook. Reframe the victim as the aggressor, make reasonable boundaries sound like selfish cruelty. But what struck me was how practiced it sounded. Like she'd rehearsed these exact phrases. "I'm not shutting anyone out," I said. "I'm following Grandpa's will exactly as he wrote it." "But that's just it," she said, her tone shifting to reasonable explanation. "Wills aren't scripture, sweetheart. They're starting points for family discussions. Theodore wrote that will when he was feeling frustrated with your father about some business disagreements. He never intended for it to be the final word on how his legacy would be handled." This was a new lie, more sophisticated than their previous attempts. Now my grandfather's clear intentions were being reframed as temporary emotional reactions, not carefully considered decisions. "What business disagreements?" I asked. There was a brief pause, less than a second, but enough to tell me she hadn't expected that question. "Oh, you know how men get about their projects. Theodore had some ideas about investment strategies that your father thought were too aggressive for someone his age. He argued about it a few times, and Theodore got stubborn the way he always did when someone questioned his judgment." Every word was calculated to make my grandfather sound petulant and impulsive, while making my father sound like the reasonable, concerned son. The manipulation was so smooth that if I hadn't known my grandfather personally, if I hadn't spent years watching him make careful, strategic decisions, I might have believed it. "Mom, Grandpa was one of the most level-headed people I've ever known. He didn't make major decisions based on emotional reactions." "That's what we all thought," she said sadly. "But Victoria, people change when they get older. They become more suspicious, more likely to play favorites. It breaks my heart to say this about Theodore, but in his final years, he started seeing conspiracies everywhere, thinking people were trying to take advantage of him." The irony was staggering. My grandfather had indeed been suspicious in his final years, but he'd been right. The classified documents proved that people actually were taking advantage of him, stealing from the military systems he'd spent his life defending. My parents were accusing him of paranoia while simultaneously proving his suspicions correct. "What kind of conspiracies?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far they'd push this narrative. "Oh, he started questioning everyone's motives," she said, warming to her theme. "He accused your father of trying to manipulate his investments, claimed that I was only visiting him to check on his financial situation. Toward the end, he was even talking about government corruption, saying he'd discovered something important that he needed to protect." My blood chilled. She was describing Operation Silent Harbor, my grandfather's investigation into defense contractor fraud, but she was framing his legitimate concerns as elderly paranoia, which meant either she knew about the investigation and was trying to discredit it, or my father had told her just enough to use it against me. Did he ever show you any evidence of this supposed corruption? I asked, genuinely curious about how far they'd pushed this narrative. Oh, he started questioning everyone's motives, she said, warming to her theme. He accused your father of trying to manipulate his investments, claimed that I was only visiting him to check on his financial situation. Toward the end, he was even talking about government corruption, saying he'd discovered something important that he needed to protect. That's exactly what I mean, she said triumphantly. He kept talking about having proof and documents, but whenever we asked to see them, he'd get secretive and suspicious. Classic signs of cognitive decline, thinking you have important information that you need to hide from everyone, even family. The manipulation was brilliant in its simplicity. Take my grandfather's legitimate secrecy about a classified investigation and reframe it as evidence of mental decline. Anyone who didn't know about Operation Silent Harbor would find her explanation completely believable. Victoria, she continued, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, there's something else you need to know. Your father has been struggling with some financial difficulties lately. Nothing serious, but enough that losing Theodore's support has put real stress on our retirement planning. Here was the emotional hook. Not just guilt about family unity, but concern about my parents' financial security. The message was clear. Be a good daughter and take care of your struggling parents, even if it means ignoring your grandfather's wishes. What kind of financial difficulties?
Another pause, this one longer. Well, some of your father's consulting contracts didn't renew the way we expected, and my business has been affected by the economic uncertainty. We're not in crisis, but Theodore's estate could make the difference between comfortable retirement and real financial stress. The admission was carefully crafted to generate sympathy without revealing too much detail. But combined with what I'd learned from Operation Silent Harbor, it painted a different picture. If my father was involved in defense contractor fraud, his consulting contracts might be disappearing because his illegal activities were being investigated. Have you considered that Dad's contract problems might be related to his work with defense companies? The silence that followed lasted 4 full seconds, an eternity in a phone conversation. When my mother spoke again, her voice had lost its emotional warmth and taken on a sharper edge. What do you mean by that? I mean that if he's involved in anything questionable with his Pentagon consulting work, it might explain why his contracts are drying up. Victoria Ann Hayes, she said, using my full name the way she had when I was 12 and in serious trouble, I cannot believe you would suggest that your father is involved in anything unethical. He spent 30 years serving this country through civilian support roles. And you're talking about him like he's some kind of criminal? The shift from manipulation to indignation was so abrupt, it confirmed my suspicions. She was deflecting, using righteous anger to avoid answering the actual question. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking why a Pentagon consultant with 3 decades of experience is suddenly having trouble finding work. Because government contracting is unpredictable, she snapped. Budgets change, priorities shift, politics interfere with professional relationships. Your father is dealing with the same challenges every consultant faces. But I knew from my grandfather's documents that my father wasn't just any consultant. He was specifically involved with companies that were systematically defrauding the Defense Department. And if that investigation was advancing, his sudden unemployment made perfect sense. Mom, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to sign away my inheritance, no matter how many emotional appeals you make or financial problems you describe. Grandpa left me that money and property for his own reasons, and I'm going to respect his decision. The silence that followed was different from her previous pauses. This one felt like the moment in a poker game when someone realizes their bluff has been called. Victoria, she said, finally, her voice cold and controlled, you're making a very serious mistake. Family loyalty isn't optional. It's not something you can turn on and off based on legal technicalities. And what does that mean, exactly? It means that if you insist on treating your parents like enemies instead of family, you might find that family loyalty works both ways. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Stand against us, and we'll stand against you. Combined with Whittemore's warnings about career damage, it was clear that my parents were prepared to destroy me professionally and personally if I didn't surrender my grandfather's estate. As I hung up and continued my run, I realized that everything I'd believed about my family was not just wrong. It was deliberately constructed lies designed to hide criminal activity that had cost soldiers' lives. My parents weren't just greedy. They were part of a conspiracy that my grandfather had died trying to expose, and they were willing to use 24 years of manufactured love and trust to silence the one person who could bring them to justice. By Friday morning, my parents had taken their campaign public in a way that caught me completely off guard. I was checking my phone during a briefing break when notifications started flooding in. Facebook tags, LinkedIn messages, missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. The first post I saw was on my mother's Facebook page, shared to her 847 friends with a black and white photo of my grandfather in his dress uniform from 1985. The caption read, "Heartbroken to share that our family is being torn apart by greed. Theodore Hayes served his country for 45 years, believing in honor, duty, and taking care of family. Now his own granddaughter refuses to honor his true wishes, choosing legal technicalities over family unity. Please pray for healing in the Hayes family during this difficult time. Hashtag family first, hashtag military family, hashtag grief and greed." Within 3 hours, the post had 124 comments and 89 shares. People I'd never heard of were offering sympathy to my mother and expressing outrage at my supposed selfishness. Several commented that military families should stick together, that I was dishonoring my grandfather's memory by hoarding his legacy. But the Facebook post was just the beginning. My father had reached out to the Fort Riverside Family Readiness Group newsletter, which served military families across 3 bases. The article, titled "Estate Disputes Tear Military Families Apart," didn't mention names, but included enough specific details that anyone who knew our family would immediately recognize the situation. When a decorated general passes away after decades of service, his final wishes should be honored with dignity and respect, the article read. Unfortunately, grief and financial pressure can sometimes lead family members to make decisions that prioritize individual gain over collective healing. Estate planning experts recommend that military families establish clear communication and professional mediation to prevent estate disputes from destroying relationships that have survived multiple deployments and decades of service. The article was crafted to sound like objective journalism, while painting me as the selfish family member destroying military unity. It even included quotes from estate planning experts about the importance of compromise and family communication, though I suspected these experts were connected to Harrison and Associates. The most damaging piece appeared in the Millfield Heights community newsletter, which served the suburban neighborhood where I'd grown up. My mother had written a guest editorial titled, "When Military Service Divides Families Instead of Unites Them."
My daughter Victoria has served our country with distinction for over 20 years, she wrote. I am proud of her dedication and sacrifice, but military training sometimes teaches people to think in terms of individual mission success rather than collective welfare. As we grieve the loss of my father-in-law, General Theodore Hayes, I pray that Victoria will remember that family bonds are stronger than legal documents, that compromise is more valuable than winning, and that her grandfather's true legacy lies in the love he shared with all of us, not the assets he accumulated. The editorial was a masterpiece of manipulation, presenting my mother as the grieving, reasonable family member trying to heal divisions, while I was portrayed as the rigid military officer who valued rules over relationships. She even managed to use my military service, something I'd always been proud of, as evidence of my inability to function in civilian family dynamics. The comment section below the editorial was brutal. Neighbors who'd known me since childhood were expressing disappointment that I'd become too military to care about family. Several people shared stories about their own family estate disputes with the clear message that I should be more flexible and generous. What made the public campaign particularly effective was its subtle coordination. Each piece, the Facebook post, the newsletter article, the community editorial, reinforced the others while appearing to be organic expressions of concern. Together, they created a narrative where my parents were the reasonable, hurt family members, while I was the cold, legalistic daughter who'd forgotten her values. By noon, I'd received 7 phone calls from extended family members asking if the social media posts were accurate. My Aunt Jennifer, who'd always been close to my grandfather, called from Phoenix to express her concern about the family situation. "Victoria, honey, I'm seeing some troubling things online about your grandfather's estate. I know grief affects people differently, but I hope you'll consider what Theodore would have really wanted for his family." "Aunt Jennifer, have you read Grandpa's actual will?" "Well, no, but Patricia shared some of the details with me. It sounds like Theodore was feeling isolated in his final years and made some decisions that don't reflect his true feelings about family." The narrative was spreading through our extended family network like a virus, with my mother's version of events being accepted as truth before I'd even had the chance to defend myself. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of concern, gentle suggestions that I was being unreasonable, and subtle pressure to do the right thing for family harmony. The most insidious part was how they used my military service against me. In post after post, comment after comment, my dedication to duty was reframed as rigid inflexibility. My respect for legal processes was characterized as cold bureaucratic thinking. My refusal to compromise was presented as evidence that I'd lost touch with civilian values like compassion and family loyalty. Major Stevens pulled me aside after lunch, his expression carefully professional. "Colonel Hayes, I don't want to pry into personal matters, but there's been some chatter on the family support networks about estate issues. Is everything okay?" The question was innocent enough, but it confirmed my worst fears. The public campaign wasn't just damaging my family relationships, it was starting to affect my professional reputation. Military communities are small and gossip travels fast, especially when it involves money and family conflict. "It's a private family matter that's being handled through proper legal channels," I said, using the neutral tone I'd perfected for dealing with media inquiries during deployments. "Of course, but if you need any support or resources, the Army has counselors who specialize in family financial disputes. Sometimes professional mediation can help resolve these situations before they become more complicated." Even my own second-in-command was subtly suggesting that I should compromise rather than fight, that professional mediation might be preferable to legal confrontation. The campaign was working exactly as my parents had intended, creating social pressure from every direction to make me surrender rather than face continued public scrutiny. That evening, I found myself scrolling through social media posts about our family drama, reading comments from strangers who felt qualified to judge my character based on carefully crafted propaganda. The anger I felt wasn't just about the lies they were spreading, it was about how effectively they were using my own values against me. They knew I spent my entire career caring about honor, integrity, and service before self, so they reframed my defense of my grandfather's wishes as selfish greed. They knew I valued family relationships, so they painted me as someone who prioritized money over love. They knew I respected military tradition, so they suggested I'd forgotten the values my grandfather had taught me. The public campaign wasn't just about stealing my inheritance anymore. It was about destroying my character so thoroughly that even if I won legally, I'd lose everything else. My family relationships, my community standing, potentially even my military career. But as I sat in my quarters that night, reading post after post of manipulation disguised as concern, I realized something important. They were working so hard to control the narrative because they were terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. All this public pressure, all these emotional appeals, all this character assassination, it was the behavior of people who knew they were guilty and were desperately trying to prevent exposure. The classified document in my safe wasn't just evidence of defense contractor fraud. It was proof that my parents were willing to destroy their own daughter's reputation to hide their criminal activities. The war was no longer just about money or family loyalty.
The character assassination campaign had been running for 48 hours when I decided to stop reacting and start strategizing. 22 years of military training had taught me that defensive positions only work if you control the terrain, and right now, my parents were dictating every engagement. It was time to shift to offensive operations. Saturday morning at 0500 hours, I drove off base to a small coffee shop in downtown Riverside where I'd arranged to meet Colonel Rebecca Torres, a retired Army JAG officer who now ran a private practice specializing in military legal issues. Torres had been my mentor during my early career, someone I trusted completely, and, more importantly, someone with the security clearance necessary to understand what I was really dealing with. "Victoria," she said, sliding into the booth across from me with a steaming mug and a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived multiple deployments. "I've been following the situation through mutual friends. This is more complicated than a simple estate dispute." I pulled out a secure tablet and showed her the classified documents my grandfather had left me. Torres's expression grew increasingly grim as she scrolled through Operation Silent Harbor, occasionally stopping to examine specific details about defense contractor fraud. "Jesus Christ," she muttered, using language that would have gotten us both in trouble during official meetings. "Your grandfather uncovered systematic fraud involving at least 12 major contractors and approximately $40 million in diverted funds? This isn't just inheritance money they're after. They're trying to bury evidence that could send dozens of people to federal prison." "Including my parents," I said. Torres nodded, her finger tracing connections between companies on the document. "Your father's consulting work put him in position to facilitate fraudulent contracts, and your mother's business appears to be receiving kickback payments disguised as legitimate fees. They're not just stealing from you. They're accessories to stealing from the entire Defense Department." We spent the next 2 hours developing what Torres called a comprehensive defense strategy that addressed both the immediate inheritance threat and the larger national security implications. The plan had 4 phases: secure the evidence, build an unassailable legal position, document all harassment and intimidation, and prepare for federal intervention. "First," Torres said, pulling out a secure phone, "we need to get these documents into official channels. I'm calling Agent Sarah Kim at the Defense Criminal Investigation Service. She specializes in contractor fraud, and she'll understand the implications immediately." While Torres made the call, I began documenting every interaction I'd had with my parents since my grandfather's death. Phone recordings, social media screenshots, email threads, witness statements from neighbors who'd observed their behavior at the funeral. Military intelligence had taught me that evidence without documentation is just storytelling, and I was building a case that would stand up under federal scrutiny. Agent Kim arrived at the coffee shop within 90 minutes, dressed in civilian clothes but carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to investigating serious crimes. She was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she didn't waste time on small cases. "Colonel Hayes," she said, settling into our booth after checking the surrounding tables for potential eavesdroppers. "Colonel Torres briefed me on the situation. I need to see these documents immediately." I handed over the classified materials,
watching Kim's expression grow increasingly grim as she absorbed the scope of Operation Silent Harbor. She asked pointed questions about my grandfather's investigation methods, the timeline of his discoveries, and my parents' knowledge of his activities. "This is a federal case," Kim said, securing the documents in her briefcase. "Defense contractor fraud of this magnitude falls under DCIS jurisdiction, and we've actually been building related cases against several of these companies for the past 18 months. Your grandfather's investigation fills gaps we didn't even know existed." "What does that mean for the inheritance situation?" Torres asked. "It means everything changes. If the Hayes parents are attempting to suppress evidence of federal crimes through inheritance manipulation, that's obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and potentially witness intimidation. We'll be opening a formal investigation immediately." Kim explained that federal involvement would freeze all estate proceedings until the criminal investigation was complete. My parents' public campaign would be viewed as potential witness tampering, and their attorneys' threats about my military career could constitute intimidation of a federal witness. "Colonel Hayes," Kim said, "you need to understand that you're now a protected witness in a federal investigation. Any further attempts to pressure you into surrendering the inheritance or withdrawing from the estate proceedings will be treated as federal crimes." After Kim left, Torres and I spent another hour developing operational security protocols. She arranged for a secure document storage facility to hold copies of all evidence, established encrypted communication channels for ongoing coordination, and provided me with a legal team that specialized in cases involving national security implications. "Your parents made a critical error," Torres explained, as we walked to our cars. "They assumed you were just your naive military daughter who could be manipulated through guilt and family pressure. They didn't realize they were attacking someone with the training, resources, and moral authority to fight back effectively." By Sunday afternoon, I had assembled what military strategists call comprehensive defensive capabilities. My legal team included Torres, a probate specialist, and a federal criminal defense attorney. My evidence was secured in multiple locations with properly maintained chain of custody documentation. Every communication was being recorded and preserved according to federal investigative standards. More importantly, I had begun building my own public counter-narrative. Instead of responding defensively to my parents' social media attacks, I drafted a carefully worded statement that positioned me as someone honoring a decorated general's final wishes while cooperating with federal authorities on related matters. "I am proud to serve as executor of General Theodore Hayes' estate, ensuring that his life's work and final wishes are honored with the dignity and respect he earned through 45 years of military service. While some family members have chosen to contest his clearly expressed intentions, I remain committed to fulfilling my responsibilities exactly as he outlined them. I am also cooperating fully with federal authorities on matters related to my grandfather's final service to our country." The statement was deliberately vague about the federal investigation, but it served notice that this wasn't just a family dispute anymore. Anyone following the social media drama would understand that government authorities were involved, which would make my parents' manipulation campaign look increasingly desperate and potentially criminal. I also reached out to 3 retired generals who had served with my grandfather, asking them to provide character references that could counter the narrative about his mental decline. Each man was outraged at the suggestion that General Hayes had been confused or manipulative in his final years. "Theodore Hayes was sharp as a tack until the day he died," General Morrison told me during a recorded phone call. "If he left his estate to you exclusively, it's because he had damn good reasons. Anyone suggesting otherwise never really knew the man." By Monday morning, I had transformed from a defensive target into an offensive threat. My parents thought they were fighting a grieving granddaughter over money. Instead, they were now facing a federal witness with legal representation, documented evidence of their criminal activities, and the full weight of the Defense Criminal Investigative Service backing her position. The war they'd started was about to become a battle they couldn't possibly win, and they didn't even know it yet. Tuesday morning at 0347 hours, my base security alarm system triggered a proximity alert that jolted me out of deep sleep. The motion sensors around my quarters had detected movement in the restricted parking area, which should have been impossible given the multiple checkpoints required to access officer housing on Fort Riverside. I grabbed my service weapon and moved to the window, using night vision training to scan the area without exposing my position. What I saw made my blood run cold. 2 figures in civilian clothes were crouched beside my personal vehicle, one holding what appeared to be an electronic device, while the other acted as lookout. My first instinct was to call base security, but something stopped me. These weren't random criminals attempting a break-in on a military installation. That would be suicidal stupidity. These were professionals who somehow had access to a secure facility, which meant they were either military personnel or had been provided with legitimate credentials. I activated my phone's camera and began recording, zooming in on the figures while maintaining my concealed position. The man with the electronic device appeared to be attaching something to the undercarriage of my car, working with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. The lookout was scanning the area with night vision equipment, suggesting this was a coordinated surveillance operation. After approximately 8 minutes, both figures retreated toward the perimeter fence, where I could see a third person waiting with what looked like military-grade wire cutters. They had infiltrated a secure military installation, accessed restricted housing areas, and tampered with an officer's personal vehicle, all without triggering any official security responses. The implications were terrifying. Either they had inside help from military personnel, or they had obtained legitimate base access credentials through connections I didn't want to think about. Given my father's 30 years of Pentagon consulting work, both possibilities seemed entirely plausible. At 04:30 a.m., I called Agent Kim on the secure line she'd provided. "Agent Kim, this is Colonel Hayes. I have a situation that requires immediate federal response." 20 minutes later, Kim arrived with 2 DCIS agents and a military police unit led by Captain Rodriguez. They swept my vehicle with electronic detection equipment and found a sophisticated GPS tracking device hardwired into the car's electrical system, along with what appeared to be a listening device installed near the driver's seat. "This is military-grade surveillance equipment," Agent Kim said, examining the devices with evident concern. Captain Rodriguez was reviewing the security footage I had recorded on my phone, his expression growing increasingly grim. "Colonel Hayes, these individuals bypassed multiple checkpoints to access your quarters. That requires either stolen credentials or inside assistance from someone with base access authority." The DCIS technical team spent 3 hours sweeping my quarters, office, and personal belongings for additional surveillance devices. They found 2 more listening devices, one in my office telephone and another in the base housing unit's main room. Someone had been monitoring my conversations for an unknown period of time. "Colonel," Agent Kim said, as the technical team finished their work, "this surveillance operation represents a clear escalation in the intimidation campaign against you. More importantly, it constitutes multiple federal crimes, trespassing on a military installation, installing surveillance equipment without authorization, and potentially espionage depending on what information they obtained." Agent Kim explained that the sophistication of the equipment and the precision of the installation suggested this wasn't the work of private investigators hired by my parents' attorney. This was either government-level surveillance or had been conducted by people with access to government resources. "We're treating this as a potential national security breach. Anyone willing to infiltrate a military installation to monitor a federal witness in a defense contractor fraud case has moved far beyond civil litigation into criminal conspiracy." By 800 hours, Fort Riverside was in full security lockdown mode.
Military police were conducting comprehensive sweeps of all personnel with recent base access, reviewing security footage from every checkpoint, and interviewing anyone who might have observed suspicious activity. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Wang, personally briefed all officers about potential security compromises.
But the most shocking discovery came when DCIS agents traced the surveillance equipment's serial numbers. The GPS tracking device had been purchased through a Pentagon procurement account associated with Meridian Defense Solutions, the same company that featured prominently in my grandfather's Operation Silent Harbor documents. "Your parents aren't just trying to steal your inheritance," Agent Kim told me during a secure briefing at 1200 hours. "They're part of a criminal network that includes defense contractors willing to use military-grade surveillance against a federal witness. This is organized crime disguised as a family dispute." The investigation revealed that someone with legitimate Pentagon access had requisitioned the surveillance equipment 3 weeks earlier, coincidentally just 2 days after my grandfather's funeral. The requisition had been authorized through channels that my father's consulting work would have given him access to, though proving his direct involvement would require additional investigation. Agent Kim assigned a protective detail to monitor my activities both on and off base. "Colonel Hayes, you need to understand that we're no longer dealing with family pressure or legal intimidation. These people have demonstrated willingness to commit federal felonies to silence you, which means they view you as a genuine threat to something much bigger than inheritance money." That afternoon, I received a phone call from Attorney Whitmore that was clearly intended to gauge whether I knew about the surveillance operation. His tone was different, less confident, more probing. "Colonel Hayes, I hope you're reconsidering your position on the estate settlement. My clients are becoming increasingly concerned about the delays and the impact on family relationships." "Your clients should be more concerned about the federal investigation into defense contractor fraud," I replied, watching for his reaction. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds, long enough to confirm that he knew exactly what I was talking about. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its professional polish. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'd caution against making accusations that could damage your military career. False allegations about federal crimes can have serious consequences for someone with security clearance." The threat was clear, but desperate. They knew the federal investigation was advancing. They knew I was under protective surveillance, and they knew their surveillance operation had been discovered. Whitmore's call was a fishing expedition to determine how much I knew about their criminal activities. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, "any further contact from you or your clients should go through my federal legal representation. Agent Sarah Kim at DCIS will be handling all communication regarding this matter." After hanging up, I sat in my office reviewing the day's events. My parents had escalated from family pressure to legal intimidation to social media character assassination to federal surveillance crimes. They had violated military security, tampered with federal evidence, and demonstrated willingness to commit serious felonies to prevent exposure of their criminal activities. But they'd also made a critical error. By crossing into federal crimes against a military installation, they'd transformed this from a civil dispute into a national security investigation. Every resource of the federal government was now focused on uncovering the full scope of their criminal network. The surveillance operation wasn't just evidence of their desperation, it was proof that Operation Silent Harbor had uncovered something worth risking decades in federal prison to suppress. My grandfather's investigation hadn't just found contractor fraud, it had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached deep into Pentagon contracting systems. As I locked the classified documents in my newly secured office safe that evening, I realized that my parents' biggest mistake hadn't been trying to steal my inheritance, it had been underestimating exactly how far I was willing to go to honor my grandfather's final mission and bring his killers to justice. But the most shocking discovery came when DCIS agents traced the surveillance equipment serial numbers. The GPS tracking device had been purchased through a Pentagon procurement account associated with Meridian Defense Solutions, the same company that featured prominently in my grandfather's Operation Silent Harbor documents. "Your parents aren't just trying to steal your inheritance," Agent Kim told me during a secure briefing at 1200 hours. "They're part of a criminal network that includes defense contractors willing to use military-grade surveillance against a federal witness. This is organized crime disguised as a family dispute." The investigation revealed that someone with legitimate Pentagon access had requisitioned the surveillance equipment 3 weeks earlier, coincidentally, just 2 days after my grandfather's funeral. The requisition had been authorized through channels that my father's consulting work would have given him access to, though proving his direct involvement would require additional investigation. Agent Kim assigned a protective detail to monitor my activities both on and off base. "Colonel Hayes, you need to understand that we're no longer dealing with family pressure or legal intimidation. These people have demonstrated a willingness to commit federal felonies to silence you, which means they view you as a genuine threat to something much bigger than inheritance money." That afternoon, I received a phone call from Attorney Whitmore that was clearly intended to gauge whether I knew about the surveillance operation. His tone was different, less confident, more probing. "Colonel Hayes, I hope you're reconsidering your position on the estate settlement. My clients are becoming increasingly concerned about the delays and the impact on family relationships." "Your clients should be more concerned about the federal investigation into defense contractor fraud," I replied, watching for his reaction. The silence that followed lasted nearly 10 seconds, long enough to confirm that he knew exactly what I was talking about. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its professional polish. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'd caution against making accusations that could damage your military career. False allegations about federal crimes can have serious consequences for someone with security clearance." The threat was clear, but desperate. They knew the federal investigation was advancing, they knew I was under protective surveillance, and they knew their surveillance operation had been discovered. Whitmore's call was a fishing expedition to determine how much I knew about their criminal activities. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, "any further contact from you or your clients should go through my federal legal representation. Agent Sarah Kim at DCIS will be handling all communication regarding this matter." After hanging up, I sat in my office reviewing the day's events. My parents had escalated from family pressure to legal intimidation to social media character assassination to federal surveillance crimes. They had violated military security, tampered with federal evidence, and demonstrated willingness to commit serious felonies to prevent exposure of their criminal activities. But they'd also made a critical error. By crossing into federal crimes against a military installation, they transformed this from a civil dispute into a national security investigation. Every resource of the federal government was now focused on uncovering the full scope of their criminal network. The surveillance operation wasn't just evidence of their desperation, it was proof that Operation Silent Harbor had uncovered something worth risking decades in federal prison to suppress. My grandfather's investigation hadn't just found contractor fraud. It had exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached deep into Pentagon contracting systems. As I locked the classified documents in my newly secured office safe that evening, I realized that my parents' biggest mistake hadn't been trying to steal my inheritance. It had been underestimating exactly how far I was willing to go to honor my grandfather's final mission and bring his killers to justice. The federal courthouse in Richmond was buzzing with an energy I'd never experienced before. What had started as a routine probate hearing for my grandfather's estate had transformed into something that required military police cordoning off the building and federal marshals screening every person who entered. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Colonel Torres, watching my parents enter the courtroom with Attorney Whitmore, all three of them wearing expressions of confident determination.
They had no idea what was waiting for them in the manila envelope I held in my lap. No understanding that their carefully orchestrated inheritance grab was about to collide with a federal investigation that would destroy everything they'd built over decades of criminal activity. Judge Eleanor Fitzgerald took the bench at exactly 9:00 hours. Her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She'd been briefed by federal prosecutors about the national security implications of the case, though the specific details remained sealed. This court is here to address the estate dispute between Victoria Hayes and David and Patricia Hayes regarding the will of General Theodore Hayes. However, I've been informed that federal authorities may have relevant information that impacts these proceedings. Whitmore stood immediately, clearly prepared for this moment. Your Honor, we respectfully request that any federal matters be handled separately from this civil estate dispute. My clients are simply seeking fair distribution of family assets, according to what they believe were General Hayes's true intentions for family unity and shared prosperity. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Fitzgerald replied, the court will determine the scope of relevant evidence. You may proceed with your opening arguments. For the next 30 minutes, Whitmore delivered a masterful performance. He painted my grandfather as an elderly man who'd become suspicious and isolated in his final years, making impulsive financial decisions and estate changes based on whoever had his ear most recently. He presented my parents as loving family members who were simply trying to honor what they believed were General Hayes's true wishes for family unity and shared prosperity.
General Hayes was a brilliant military strategist, Whitmore said, his voice filled with apparent respect. But his final years were marked by increasing paranoia about government corruption and conspiracy theories that had no basis in reality. The will favoring his granddaughter exclusively reflects this paranoid mindset, not rational estate planning. My mother testified tearfully about her father-in-law's mental decline, describing conversations where he'd claimed to have discovered government secrets and talked about dangerous people who were targeting him. She made his legitimate investigation into defense contractor fraud sound like the delusions of a confused old man. My father spoke about his decades of government service and his concerns about my emotional state, suggesting that grief had made me possessive of assets that should benefit the entire family. He even produced witnesses, neighbors, and family friends who testified that I'd seemed distant and controlling during my grandfather's final months. It was a comprehensive character assassination disguised as estate testimony, designed to make me look like someone who'd manipulated a vulnerable elderly man for financial gain. If I hadn't known the truth about Operation Silent Harbor, I might have been impressed by the sophistication of their deception. When it was my turn to respond, I stood and walked to the center of the courtroom, holding the manila envelope that contained the classified documents my grandfather had died protecting. Your Honor, I said, I request permission to submit evidence that directly contradicts the testimony we've just heard and reveals the true scope of what this case is actually about. Judge Fitzgerald nodded. You may proceed, Colonel Hayes. I opened the envelope and pulled out the Operation Silent Harbor documents, their red classified markings clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, these documents represent a federal investigation conducted by General Theodore Hayes into systematic fraud within Defense Department contracting systems. The investigation details criminal activities involving multiple companies and individuals, including my parents, David and Patricia Hayes. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Whitmore jumped to his feet. Objection! This appears to be classified material that has no bearing on estate distribution. Your Honor, I continued, these documents prove that General Hayes's decision to exclude my parents from his estate was based on his discovery of their involvement in criminal activities that have cost American soldiers their lives. That's when the courtroom doors burst open.
Agent Kim entered with 6 military police officers and 2 federal marshals, their combat boots echoing off the marble floor like thunder. Behind them came Colonel Marcus Webb, the base commander from Fort Riverside, wearing his dress uniform and carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding immediate respect. "Your Honor," Agent Kim announced, "the Defense Criminal Investigative Service is placing David Hayes and Patricia Hayes under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government, obstruction of justice, and violations of the Espionage Act." The military police moved with practiced efficiency, reading my parents their rights while Whitmore stammered objections that carried no legal weight in a federal criminal matter. My mother's carefully maintained composure cracked completely as handcuffs clicked around her wrists, her voice rising to a shriek that echoed through the suddenly silent courtroom. "This is insane! Victoria, how could you do this to your own family?" But the most shocking moment came when Colonel Webb approached the defense table and placed his hand on Attorney Whitmore's shoulder. "Jonathan Whitmore," he said, in the tone reserved for court-martial proceedings, "you are also under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation and for accepting payments from foreign intelligence services through Meridian Defense Solutions." The courtroom erupted. Spectators who'd come expecting a routine family dispute were witnessing the arrest of defendants in what Agent Kim later described as one of the largest defense contractor fraud cases in military history. Judge Fitzgerald called for order, but her voice was almost lost in the chaos as federal agents secured the scene and military police established a perimeter around the arrested individuals. The manila envelope in my hand, the single piece of paper that had triggered this entire federal response, contained evidence that would ultimately result in 43 arrests, the recovery of over $60 million in stolen defense funds, and prison sentences that would keep the conspirators locked away for decades. As my parents were led away in federal custody, my mother turned back toward me one final time. "You destroyed your own family for money," she screamed, her voice raw with rage and desperation. But she was wrong. I hadn't destroyed my family for money. I'd honored my grandfather's final mission and exposed criminals who had been stealing from the military systems designed to protect American soldiers. The money had never been the point. Justice was. Standing in that federal courtroom, watching military police execute arrests based on evidence my grandfather had died protecting, I finally understood what he'd meant in his final letter. The inheritance wasn't just about financial security, it was about having the resources and independence necessary to fight corruption at the highest levels of government. 6 months later, I stood in my grandfather's study in Colorado Springs, now officially mine through an uncontested estate transfer. The $4.2 million inheritance had grown to $5.8 million through careful investment management, and I'd established the General Theodore Hayes Foundation for Military Ethics, providing resources for service members who discover corruption and needed support to report it safely. My parents were serving 15-year federal sentences in different facilities, their guilty pleas having sealed the cases against dozens of co-conspirators. Whitmore received 25 years for his role as the legal facilitator of the criminal network, his law license permanently revoked. The final irony was that my inheritance actually did stay in the family, just not the family my parents had expected. I used part of the funds to support other military families facing retaliation for reporting corruption, creating the network of support my grandfather had envisioned when he chose me as his heir. Some battles are worth fighting not because you want to win, but because losing means abandoning everything you believe in. My parents had tried to use family loyalty against me, never understanding that true loyalty meant protecting the values my grandfather had died defending, not the people who'd betrayed them. The classified document that brought military police storming into a federal courtroom wasn't just evidence of fraud. It was proof that honor, duty, and country aren't just words. They're principles worth defending against anyone who tries to corrupt them, even when that corruption comes from the people who taught you to value those principles in the first place. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.